Welcome to Asia Unlocked, where we cover current events and emerging trends in Asia. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Asia Unlocked. Today I'm joined by Dr. Victor Cha, who will help us make sense of recent discussions concerning Kim Jong-un's daughter, Kim Ju-hae, and what her rise might mean for North Korea. Dr. Cha is president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also Distinguished University Professor and DS Song KF Endowed Chair in Government and International Affairs at Georgetown University. Dr. Cha, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. Good to be with you.
Let's start by evaluating whether these succession claims are credible. According to South Korea's National Intelligence Service, it's increasingly likely that Kim Ju-hae will succeed Kim Jong-un, given her increasing appearance at symbolically significant locations. However, some analysts have argued that visibility isn't an appropriate indicator of whether she'll succeed Kim. Where would you say you stand in this debate? Is public appearance an appropriate metric for predicting her political trajectory?
Well, we are, reading tea leaves here because it's not like the North Koreans will put on the internet, here's our succession plan for the current North Korean leader. But it is the case that, she has been put front and center in a lot of the staged propaganda, photos, site visits, inspections, things of this nature that the leader has done. And they clearly are giving her a prominent position. Now, whether that means she's being actively groomed to be the next leader, or whether that means he's just the dad who likes to take his daughter to intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites, we just don't know. Dictators like Kim Jong-un usually do not publicize their succession plans, because it basically puts a big target on their back and makes them effectively lame ducks. But there's no denying that there's been a lot of speculation in the South Korean media that her frequent appearances suggest that she's being eventually groomed to succeed her father.
On a related note, there's been a lot of discourse about North Korean succession in the past. So, for example, a lot of people discussed the issue during the first Trump administration when there was increasing coverage of Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Jong. But I'm wondering, when we look at past successions in the North Korean regime, is there a model that is followed? Would you say that there is a pattern when it comes to succession of the leader, or would you say it's different by leader?
Yeah. So we have a small n, as we would say in social science, a limited set by which to induce these sorts of things. Basically, if you had to generalize from the pattern we have today, it's basically succession happens this way. The North Korean leader dies of some sort of heart problem suddenly, and then the son is thrust into the stage as the next leader. That's what happened when Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, died in 1994. His son was suddenly, Kim Jong-il was put on the stage. And then when Kim Jong-il died suddenly, again, of a heart issue, a stroke, in whatever 2011, 2012, then his son took over. So it happens through crisis, very clearly. The other thing that is interesting is that it happens generationally. In other words, it happens vertically and not horizontally. So it goes from the grandfather to the father and now to the son. And then, at least according to South Korean media reports, and then next to the daughter, if something were to happen to the current leader. What's interesting about the sister, Kim Jong, as you said, Eric, during the Trump summits in the first Trump administration with the North Korean leader, she was very much on display, playing the role of like a trusted lieutenant to her brother. And that raised at the time some speculation that she might be part of the leadership or next in line. But I don't think that that's the case. As I said, from what we know from past successions, this has always happened vertically. It hasn't happened horizontally. And let's say if the North Korean leader were to die tomorrow of a massive heart attack, I think the bet would be that Ju-hae would be the successor but she would be surrounded by a group of elders that would include Kim Jong, the younger sister, to help govern as a group until Kim Ju-hae became old enough to make decisions on her own. Um, but the sister very much, her role has changed over time too. Initially, we first saw her as this enigmatic figure that came to South Korea for the 2018 Winter Olympics, to basically help set up the inter-Korean summits that then led to the Trump summits. Um, then she became much more of this trusted lieutenant to her brother during the Trump summits. And she just got recently promoted to head of the propaganda department, where she has been sort of the hardliner vis-a-vis South Korea and the United States, while her brother has been playing the role of sort of statesman, worldly statesman. So her role has also evolved under Kim Jong Un.
I want to follow up on what you mentioned about vertical succession. So, one of the things that I noticed while getting ready for this episode is that while different people may approach the issue from different angles, they are all very consistent in discussing gender politics and the role of gender or gender as a barrier when it comes to succession. Specifically, a lot of analysts have talked about how, in the event of succession, the fact that she is not Kim Jong un's son would pose a barrier. What's your take on that? And also, what do you think about the role of gender politics in future succession for North Korea?
So North Korea is definitely a patriarchal society. There's no denying that. But at least in my reading of it, the most important thing with regard to succession in North Korea is blood. That is, it is based on sort of this dynastic succession process where, the North Korean leadership is basically a cross between secular leader and religious leader and royalty. And so, in that sense, it can only be direct descendants of Kim Jong Un that would occupy the position. And for whatever reason, Ju-hae, the daughter, has been chosen as opposed to, supposedly there's a son, there may be others. She has been chosen. Um, Again, even though North Korean and Korean society in general has strongly favored men, what's interesting, if you look at the history of Korean political leadership over time, both in the North and the South, um, it is not unusual for Korea to have women leaders. In South Korea, Park Geun-hye was the leader of South Korea for a while. She was the daughter of the 1970s dictator in Korea, Park Chung-hee. Um, and going even further back in Korean history, Queen Min was the leader of Korea. This was pre like 19th century, was leader of Korea. So in that sense, it wouldn't surprise me necessarily that Ju-hae would be the one who could be considered the leader just for the reasons I've outlined. At the same time, though, what is interesting to note is that the only people that Kim Jong Un has allowed to be sort of publicly displayed with him regularly in pictures and otherwise have only been female members of the family, right? It was first his wife, then it was his younger sister, and now it's his daughter. And so, in that sense, also, um, this may reflect a sense of insecurity on the part of Kim Jong Un, that he feels less threatened if he surrounds himself with some of the female members of the family than if he surrounded himself with a male member of the family. Because if it were a man or a boy, then everybody would immediately say, like, oh, this is the successor, this is the key person, this is the peer competitor. Like, that's immediately what people would jump to in sort of Korea's patriarchal lens. So I guess I'm saying two things here. One, it to me, it's not unprecedented that the succession could go to a woman, because the most important thing is the bloodline. But two, at the same time, I think Kim Jong Un feels less threatened when he allows female members of his family to be pictured with him and somehow involved in his running of the state as opposed to male members. Because we know what he did to his uncle, right? Right? He had his uncle executed. He had his older brother executed. So there you go. Yeah.
Follow-up question on that point. So you talked about how the most important thing is blood or dynastic succession. And I'm wondering, after she rises to power, what factors are important for her political legitimacy or political support? So some people have talked about, the sister possibly challenging the daughter. And in those discussions, they've talked about how the sister enjoys more support from domestic politicians as well as the military. What factors, such as political and military support, might be important for a future successor to see legitimacy and stability in North Korea?
So what we would expect to see is that at some point, the daughter, not now because she's still so young, would eventually start getting positions in the party and positions in the military, because they would need to have both the party credentials and the military credentials. All of this is, of course, manufactured. Like they're not really earning party credentials. They're not really earning military credentials. But in particular, the military credential side is important. Kim Jong Un, Kim Il Sung, the first leader of North Korea, had military credentials. He fought against the Japanese. He was a guerrilla fighter in China, fighting against the Japanese occupation forces. But Kim Jong Un had no military credentials whatsoever. So he showered himself with military credentials. And so I think you would expect to see things like that. I think if the daughter, like if something happened to Kim Jong Un and the daughter was anointed as the leader, um, I uh, I would be surprised if there were like the sister or others who would challenge that. I mean, they all internalize that the leadership of the country is associated with the family, and so if the daughter was destined to be the leader, then everybody else would try to help her succeed. That would be my guess. My guess at it. And those who didn't, like good old Uncle Chang Sung Tek, it would be executed. One of the things we saw under Kim Jong Un when he came to power, and again, his rise to power was um, much more sudden, uh, much more acute than his father's rise to power. Like his father had been in the party and being trained for well over a decade before he had to take over. Kim Jong Un really was not prepared at all. I mean, and we can see it from the photos at the funeral ceremony and his first speech that he really was not prepared at all for this. But he, eventually gave himself all these titles. He purged a bunch of people to eventually, including his uncle and his older brother, to eventually, take control of the position. Um, but I think the fact that he had such a difficult time, that his transition was so sudden, his sort of displaying of his daughter and socializing her to some of the affairs of state may be externalizing his own difficulties when he took power, by trying to both make her more accustomed to the affairs of state, socialize the country to understand like her future role, these sorts of things. Because people often ask, like, well, why, even if she were the successor, why do you put this out so early? Like, why do you have her out there so early, creating all this speculation? And it could very well be because Kim Jong Un feels like, look, nobody prepared me, so I'm going to make sure that she's prepared, even though we're not giving her titles and formally naming her.
It just so happens that outlets like the Chosun Daily mentioned that Kim Ju-hae has received the position of acting missile general director during the Ninth Workers' Party Congress. Do you think that that position is an attempt to sort of establish her legitimacy, or do you think that there might be serious consequences or powers associated with that role?
I mean, I doubt that there are powers associated with that role. I think it is starting to build her resume. Um, starting to build her resume. It's a pretty good position for a 13-year-old to have. But yeah, I think it's just part of the process.
We've talked a lot about succession and what are the implications of succession, but I wanted to change gears. So, some analysts are approaching the question from various angles, and they argue that Kim Ju-hae's publicity may not be a sign that she will succeed Kim, but instead that she could act as a reserve source of legitimacy in a future transition. Aside from the question of succession, what other factors or what other issues do you think are significant given Kim Ju-hae's increasing publicity?
It I think it's really hard. It's really hard to say. I think that her one of her first appearances was with the North Korean leader in front of a transporter erector launcher that carried a intercontinental ballistic missile. And at that time, nobody thought, well, they're doing this because they're grooming her to be a successor. But I did think that that picture, and all these pictures are meant to deliver a message as part of the official propaganda, either explicitly or subliminally to the domestic public and to an international audience, and to a South Korean audience. I think that that particular frame was showing that this huge missile in the background was there to protect the future generation of North Koreans, right, embodied in the daughter. So I think there's that kind of subliminal messaging that they use through things like this. Um, whether this becomes an alternate source of legitimacy in a transition, it's hard. It's hard to say. I think Kim Jong Un's leadership style has been much more. I don't know what the right word is. Has been much more open than his father's, and willing to show more social aspects of the family's leadership. So again, the presence of his wife at events, then of course his younger sister. But the younger sister has been always about business. It's always been about affairs of state, and now the daughter.
I'm wondering, do you think that there might be additional messages that the Kim regime is trying to signal to outward audiences? So that could be South Korea, neighbors in Asia, countries abroad, etc. What do you think might be part of, if there is one, the broader messaging strategy for North Korea?
I think the most important one is continuity and stability. I think they want to show that there's always continuity and stability in the North Korean leadership. Um, and perhaps that is why they're showing Kim Ju-hae right now. They want to show unity, and I think that is why there's been so much purging of uh, uh, members of the family that have too much outside contact, whether that was with the Chinese or whether that was with in Southeast Asia. So I think these are the most important things they're trying to message: continuity, strength, and unity. At the same time, like, we know that even though Kim Jong Un is still quite young, he is not a very healthy individual. Like, he is, massively overweight, and at least according to European diplomats pre-COVID, European diplomats that were stationed in North Korea and that would attend official events where the leader was present, according to them, their testimony, he not only is overweight, he's a heavy smoker and he's a heavy drinker, and so this doesn't actually establish a profile of a very fit individual. And we also know, based on his father and grandfather, that there is a history of strokes and heart disease on the male side of the Kim family. So in that sense, nothing's ever for certain, and they may want to show that there is continuity and unity, no matter what happens to the leader.
So I know based on our classes together, you enjoy talking about data and enjoy data analysis. I was wondering if you could do some data analysis for us. So, like we mentioned earlier, conversations about succession are not new, and conversations about Kim Jong un's daughter succeeding him are not new. For example, Reuters, NBC News, and the New York Times all released pieces describing Kim Ju-hae as her father's likely successor just last fall. But when we look at Google Trend data, the amount of engagement and the amount of interest in Kim Ju-hae has tripled since then. So when we compare interest during that previous period to the current period, there is a very clear difference. What do you think might be different now that has prompted so much more interest in Kim Joo-hae's succession?
I think the fact that she has not faded from the scene, that, she initially appeared a few years ago and it's kind of been consistent. I think that's certainly one factor. So North Korea, even though they're isolated, the leadership, they pay attention to what outside media says, what international media says, like they watch CNN or what they, whatever. They read the New York Times. I don't know if they pay for a subscription, but they read the New York Times. And so, she initially came out, there was all this speculation about her possible succession. And if they felt threatened by that, they might have pulled her back. But they didn't. Like, she still continues to be out there, as you said, Eric. She's got a position as the sort of missile field general or whatever it is now. So, I think that sort of the consistency of her appearances. She's now older than she was when she first appeared. She's experienced sort of the middle school times growth spurt. So she's now like as tall as her father and taller than her mother. And is made to dress, much more maturely than a 13-year-old or whatever age she is. They have her, basically framed and put on stage looking like a middle-aged person. So I think all of these things have sparked all this interest. And, again, because it's such an isolated place and it's so eccentric, I think people are just infatuated by these sorts of things that look like they are a Netflix drama, but they're actually real life.
One last question before we wrap up. I wanted to end on a forward looking note. So, assuming that there was a leadership transition, do you think that there would be a change in North Korea's foreign policy and its foreign policy imperatives, or do you think it would be business as usual? Additionally, how do you think neighbors in the region might respond to a possible change in leadership?
So in terms of the last question, unless there were anarchy inside of North Korea in a leadership transition, I think most of the countries on the outside would do the same thing, which is what I call the fishbowl, which is they'd be on the outside looking in, but they wouldn't want to stick their hands into the mess. I think in general that would be the case, and China would clearly try to reinforce that dynamic by telling countries like don't mess with this, don't get involved, because that's what China did the last time when Kim Jong-il died. In terms of whether foreign policy would change, with every change in North Korean leadership, there is always speculation, both inside and outside of governments, that somehow a younger generation will be more cosmopolitan, it will be more modern, it is linked to social media, it knows what's going on in the world, and this might somehow trigger some sort of reform. This is what we said about Kim Jong-il when he took over for Kim Il-sung. This is what we said about Kim Jong-un when he took over for Kim Jong-il. And in both cases, nothing happened, right? If anything, the state has gotten even more closed. Now youngsters in North Korea are publicly executed if they're caught listening to South Korean music or humming a South Korean pop song, things of this nature. It's just gotten even tougher. I mean, in retrospect, when I look at this, even though we are now in 2026 and it's hard to imagine anybody not connected to social media and things, arguably the most cosmopolitan generation in North Korean leadership was the one that existed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when North Korean leaders, party leaders, military leaders could freely go to Moscow, Beijing. They could go to East Germany, they could go to Romania, they could go to Bulgaria, Hungary, they could just travel all over the Eastern Bloc. But after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of communism and the focus only on China and only up until recently now Russia, did not give North Korean leaders much chance to go outside of their country. And for Ju-hae, at least as far as we know, like she hasn't been educated outside the country. She hasn't had the opportunity to travel. Like her father apparently went to school in Switzerland and had friends who were not Korean. It's hard to imagine that she has that opportunity. So, but nevertheless, I think if Kim Jong were to die and she were to take over, there would again be speculation that maybe it'll be different, maybe it'll be more modern, maybe they will do economic reform, maybe. But after watching three of these transitions or two of these transitions, I'm pretty skeptical that that's the case. But I'm happy to be proven wrong. I'd much rather answer your question with my prediction, my conviction, than be proved wrong, rather than to predict, the collapse of the Soviet Union after it's happened. So.
Definitely. So we'll have to keep track and see how things unfold in the future. But with that being said, I wanted to thank you again for walking us through the question of North Korean succession and also for helping us understand the significance of Kim Ju-hae's publicity. Thank you again, Dr.
Thanks,
Zhao.
Eric. Thanks for a great podcast.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. We hope you join us in tracking emerging events across the Asia Pacific and join us for our next episode of Asia Unlocked.